Hey friends, greetings from the quarantine. This is day 15 for me with no real human contact with any person that I know other than my cat, Albus Wulfric Percival Brian Dumbledore. Al for short. Couldn't plan that one again better if I wanted to. We're here hanging out in the casita, and in an effort to keep from losing my mind, I've decided to shoot yet another video on original ideas from Origins Christianity. Sorry, Albus is just being a cat. Let's see. Of all Origins' works, and he wrote a lot. The one that's considered to be his mystical masterpiece is his commentary on the Song of Songs. I love this book so much. He was the very first Christian mystic to look at this erotic love poetry in the book, the Song of Songs from the Hebrew Bible, and see it as a text that was actually an analogy, not just a love affair between two human people, but as a love affair between the divine and the human soul. And so he saw this text as being secretly filled with hidden wisdom for spiritual transformation that was relevant to all of us. Now, it's not always easy to understand, but gosh, I love it. You can't see I have it highlighted a lot, but it's too bright. I love this book. You don't need to worry about that, but of all these original ideas that I get to talk about, my favorite comes from his commentary on the Song of Songs, and that is his notion of the health-bestowing wound. The health-bestowing wound, to me, is such a beautiful idea. And I take this insight of health-bestowing wounds to mean that we are, each of us, wounded in life. And some of us carry one great wound more than any other. And yet, if we think about these wounds as health-bestowing wounds, the notion is that our greatest wound ends up becoming the very means of our salvation. Our greatest wound ends up becoming that which brings out the very best in us. Now, have you experienced that? Think about it. What is your greatest wound? And has any good in your life come directly or indirectly from that wound? I am a deeply wounded person. I know that I am, especially here, trapped by myself with no way to get away from me for 2 weeks now. I'm profoundly aware of how neurotic and wounded I am. Oh my goodness. And yet, that gives me a particular affinity for this passage and a deep love and appreciation for it. Now, if you've read the written post that I already put up about this, I shared a longer passage in which Origin seems to suggest for each of us that our own unique wounding in life shapes our own particular individual spiritual genius. And our spiritual genius is also a reflection of our deepest wound. Now, those of you who are therapists and spiritual directors know that after a while, if you hear people talk about their spiritual life enough, and you hear them talk about their intimate life enough, you start to realize you can tell a lot about someone's personal woundings from their theology and vice versa. But listen to this. Now, don't mind the archaic language, but this is the way Origin describes this, and then we'll just unpack it just for a few minutes. He says, "It beseems God to strike such souls with such a wound as this, and to smite them with such health-bestowing wounds. And the soul who is aflame with longing for God's wisdom can say, I have been wounded by wisdom. And another soul, beholding the beauty of this might and marveling at the power of the word of God, can say, I've been wounded by might. And yet another soul, contemplating the justice of the dispensations of God's providence, says, surely I've been wounded by justice. And another, beholding the vastness of his goodness and loving kindness, speaks in the same manner, and so on and so forth." Now, what does that mean? Here's the thing. All of us have different entry points to the divine and the spirit. All of us have different entry points to the great mystery. All of us have different ways of understanding. And all of us have a unique insight to offer the world because all of us have been wounded in different ways. And I love this notion that our wounding and our genius are interwoven and co-creative realities. For example, in this passage, if we've been wounded by the injustice of society, and I know some of you can relate to this, if you have been treated unfairly or you've been deeply wounded by seeing how unjust the systems that we move and groove in truly are, and that wound touches you at such a deep place, it may shape you in such a way that you are profoundly driven to see God as just. Now, we've seen an overt fixation with the justice of God work out in unhealthy ways sometimes, where people then get fixated on this idea of God as hellfire and brimstone. But on the flip side, I've seen so many people who are wounded by injustice who are then driven to understand the divine as calling us and equipping us to work for justice in the world, right? And we see that in the great transformation from retributive justice to restorative justice, and yada yada yada. A wound of justice will lead you to work for justice and to have a unique spiritual insight into justice as an aspect of the divine's unfolding here in this world. But that's not all that there is to the spiritual life, right? That's not the only lens through which to see the divine or to work for divine unfolding here. For me personally, my wound's a little different. I grew up in a Pentecostal fundamentalist Christianity that was truly mystical and experiential in the very best way, but it had some really wacky theology. For us, the world was always ending, for example. We were a very apocalyptic religion. So like with everything that's going on in the world right now, I feel right at home. This is taking me back to my childhood. In the midst of that, we were never allowed to think, and we were never allowed to question. And I was not a good fit for that component personally. So there was a lot of things that I was taught in the midst of a lot of good. There were a lot of things that I was taught that did not make sense. For example, a really easy one that I know a lot of you can relate to is it didn't make sense to me that a God who is love would send the majority of the human race to hell. It didn't make sense to me that a God who is love would send an arbitrary hurricane to punish innocent children for political policies that didn't jive with our theology, which I later came to realize were also our prejudices. We need our brain, right? We need intellectual insight sometimes as a check and balance to the bad ideas that infect our spirituality. Not only that, like I believe that curiosity is a gift, and we've talked about this a lot on the page in the last few days in some of the written posts. For me, I sought deep and wide for the answers that I saw I needed for the inconsistencies that I was being given, but also I was an inherently curious person, and it hurt me deeply that I was in an environment that repressed that. Now, in searching for answers for years and years and years, I did end up getting some truly amazing ones, and I was grateful for the quest. I also learned that education and intelligence are not always the same thing. I learned that wisdom is rarely found in the pages of a book. But I'm very, very happy with what that propelled me to, and yet I still feel that wound so deeply. In contemplative circles now, whenever someone says to me, Michael, you spend too much time in your head, you need to be in your heart, I hear the profound wisdom in that, and yet it always triggers that deep wound, because anytime someone tells me I need to get out of my head and into my heart, it triggers the suspicion that someone is gaslighting me, because that's the wound that I carry. And yet, I'm so grateful for that wound and the wrestling with it, because it drove me to learn, which was my path. It also drove me to learn the limits of learning, right? And again, this is me. You might be different. I suffered a second life-defining wound 10 years ago when my mother died on the 6-month anniversary of my brother's suicide. And I had no answers for that. But the questions that drove me shifted. At that point, I was far more interested in the question, where is God in our suffering? And how does spiritual practice truly help us to heal in the midst of grief and loss? And how do we learn to live without answers? Which we've talked about a lot in the last few days. For those of you who are super nerds, eventually we'll have a post coming up where we'll talk about the idea that the only answer to theodicy is theophany, right? And what that means is the only answer to why, if God is good and loving, are bad things allowed to happen. The only answer we really have to that is that God seems to show up in the midst of the suffering and suffer with us. We take it a step further. The only answer to theodicy is theophany that results in theosis, which is that God shows up in the midst of the suffering and we transform. But that's nerdy stuff we don't need to worry about today. And again, that's me. That's the insight that I strive for because of the wound that I carry. That's my story. What about you? What is your wound? What is your insight? I mean, what do you think about this notion? Does it make sense to you? If you reflect on your primary wound in life, is it a health-bestowing wound? Whether God wounds us for this purpose, or the divine uses our wounds, or we're involved in the process of redemption and co-creation and meaning-making, as we've been talking about lately, it's a beautiful notion to think about our wounds always being transformed in the alchemy of the spiritual life into wisdom. Our wounds become wisdom. Our difficulties lead to direction. Our losses lead to love. Because this is the thing for Origen. Ultimately, every one of these unique wounds, which all have their particular genius, all of them in the long run turn into wounds of love. And they lead us all to greater love. So I'm curious, how does that help you think about the wounds that you're carrying right now? What are the implications? One of the implications might be that we need to be true to our wounds. We need to face our wounds, our individual unique wounds, and we need to be willing to drink every drop to the dregs of what they have to offer us, right? We need to be willing to go all the way there and not run from them, but face them head on. It also means that maybe we don't suffer our wounds just for ourselves, right? Maybe facing our wound and then letting that wound inspire our particular genius happens not just for us, but on behalf of all the people around us. I used to have a mentor who was a therapist who would always say to me, Michael, the pain that you can heal, the pain that you feel is the pain that you can heal, right? And the pain that you can heal is the pain that you feel. Maybe. It's interesting also because this gives us a reason to be patient with other people who experience the divine in such profoundly different ways than we do. They're probably working out different wounds which are going to yield different wisdom. And I believe that in the long run, it will be for the betterment of all of us. I mean, you could even look at all the different world religions and mystical traditions this way. Each one has a different medicine for a different wound of the soul. I think the book God Is Not One touches on this just a little bit. If you know that, I don't remember the name of the author. If anybody has it, maybe put it in the comments. For Origen, though, again, I cannot stress this enough. If we have the courage to follow all of it through, all these wounds and all this wisdom eventually turns into a wound of love. Because for him, it was all about the love that we come from, the love that we're transformed in, the love that we're transformed into, and the love that we become, right? I love this guy. Wasn't an intellectual, he was an intellectual romantic. Probably a 4 or 5 on the Enneagram. So what do you think? Does any of this feel right to you? I'd love to know your thoughts. I'd love to know your experience with this. And hey, thanks a bunch if you actually took the time to watch this all the way through. It helps me to be a little bit less crazy in the midst of this, even if no one watches. And before I go, let's see if I can get, oh my God, Albus to come over and say hi. Albus, hey man. He's like, what are you doing to me, Michael? Do you want to say hi? Do you want to look at the people who are watching? Do you want to be like, hey bro, thanks for watching this video. stuck here quarantined with this guy who's crazy. He wants to talk about Origin all the time. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Friends, big love. Stay safe, stay sound, and stay serene as you can. All right? We'll see you later.